That's great. So, Mary, thanks to you and to Michael and to Mo for 3 presentations, which I think really show us the benefit of coming at a complex question like this from different angles, viewing it from different perspectives. So we've got about 40 minutes for questions. There's a very lively discussion going on in Q&A. We want to leave plenty of time towards the end to hear from Alexandra Baker, who's also joined us today. Alexandra's from the Pet Industry Federation, where she's the coordinator for pets and the Pets and Older People Task Force. So we do want to leave some time for that discussion around developing a code of practice. But if you'd like to turn your cameras on, feel free to do that. Certainly if Mary, Michael and Mo, you could turn your cameras on, ready to answer questions. If we could either put questions in the chat, or if people want to put their hands up, I will see those hands. Perhaps I could just kick off the questions here. I mean, Michael, you conducted the interviews, and Mo and Mary, you've both been looking into this question. Was there anything that surprised you in this research project? Anything you weren't expecting to find?
I suppose the element that I think perhaps surprised me to some extent was the sort of infrastructure going on around this. So things like when we had the dog sitting organisation, and also things like a local Good Neighbours scheme came to us and spoke about how they might be supporting an older person who might perhaps need some help with dog walking. The fact that there were just lots of different organisations sort of doing little bits of the problem, I think I hadn't quite registered quite how deep it went in terms of different organisations coming together.
Yeah, so I suppose that raises the question about how more can be done to coordinate the experience of lots of different organisations to give this issue more prominence and to kind of bring all those threads together. Maybe that's something that we can pick up in the final discussion around a code of practice. Okay, so are there any questions? Anyone who'd like to come in? I mean, it may be going back over some of the ground that's been in the chat, maybe a comment or a question, something that struck you as particularly useful that we've chatted about.
There was a question that I noticed a little while ago where someone was asking about the issue of perhaps carers being frightened of animals, which it was something that was certainly mentioned as a possibility, though I don't think there were that many examples. It was more something people were worried about than perhaps happened that much in practice. But I think that also relates to something else that came up in the chat around sort of the layout and space of care homes. So some care homes were quite clearly sort of subdivided. So there was kind of, a Rose lounge and a Jasmine lounge and a whatever else lounge. And that, I think, made it easier for those ones to perhaps say, okay, well, maybe Rose lounge is dog friendly, but the carer who really doesn't like dogs is going to work on a different lounge. So, for example, there's one care worker I spoke to who worked in a home which had a cat downstairs, and he said actually he almost never saw it because he worked upstairs. He was on a different unit all the time. So I think some of those questions around space and layout do make a difference for those kinds of elements.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment from Sue Kay about the design of care homes and the whole idea of sort of age-friendly design. And it's an important point because if you look at sort of age-friendly design and age-friendly principles, they haven't actually, to my knowledge, talked about the human-animal relationship in that context. So I think that's a really important point. And certainly from Michael's research, it seemed like the care homes that were more likely to be purpose-built, and as Michael said, sort of configured around. I hate the term units, but I'm going to say it. Units lent itself better to having more than one of the same type of animal, or more than one of different types of animals, whereas the kind of old style, rabbit warren type buildings were perhaps much less conducive, not just to supporting animals positively, but also potentially I think care homes could more justifiably say, well, it's quite risky because it's quite crowded in here and there are lots of trip hazards, or it's, difficult to kind of separate. So I think that's a really important point.
Okay, and Mary, you put your hand up as well. Is this to answer this question as well?
It was just to add on this question. My dog started barking there, so I'd muted myself. I think that question about architecture and how we design care homes is really important. And one of the things I would say now about our focus, and I mean, obviously, this is kind of project can spin off in all kinds of directions, but it was very much focused on the existing care home. And I think that question that Susan raised about design is just so crucial, and the points that Mo has been making. Because the other thing I'm just struck by in that regard is we focused very much on animals like within the care home, not so much in the outside space. But Mo and I were at a conference called Being Well Together that brought together people from a range of jurisdictions. And I mean, ours is just so focused on England. But I think looking to experiences in other jurisdictions, and particularly the Netherlands, where they have these, they're almost like farms and like pet farms and care homes, and that idea that, you know, nature can be so conducive to well-being, and that it might be a way of rehoming other animals that we wouldn't conventionally think of as fitting within that category of pet. You know, so you can have battery chickens and things like that as well. So I think that those more creative, or sometimes when we get lost in the minutiae, and then how do we move beyond, say, care planning or whatever, drawing up care plans for individual animals, how do we think in more utopian ways? It's possibly interesting as well.
I think that's a really good challenge, Mary. And at a time when the health and social care levy is being introduced, we would hope that perhaps the consumer, for want of a better word, the consumer angle of, you know, what do we want from care homes, and what will we all want when we get older and are cashing in this levy that we're paying in. Perhaps that voice will get a bit stronger as a result of there being a hypothecated tax, effectively, providing care for us if and when we need it. And there was a question, if I can just go back a little bit in the chat. Yeah, Katrina Holland, would you like to switch your mic on and ask your question, please?
I was just wondering, well, I had sort of two things I was thinking. I don't know, sorry, Fiona, which part you were referring to. The first thing I was thinking about was kind of the agency of both the person perhaps moving into the home, and whether or not they're enabled to have any agency in that decision making about moving to the home, first of all, and also about their pet and whether or not they can accompany them. And also the agency of the animals themselves, and how far that is taken into account by, again, perhaps the individual and their family or supporters, and also the care home staff, just in terms of perhaps the animal being put in situations that they might not wish to be in within the care home environment, or that they might actually prefer to be in the care home with the person, like obviously different for different animals. And then my other thing I was thinking was just thinking about whether does ageism play a role in all of this, and like cultural attitudes towards the elderly. I know in the UK particularly we don't have a great sort of record of how we treat the elderly and how we care for them compared to other places, and whether or not you've looked at different examples of the way the elderly are cared for in other countries, other societies, and also pet keeping, and where they overlap in different cultures, and how that might inform your findings or just interesting comparisons.
Okay, so Mo, would you like to pick up the question around both older people's agency, which I think you touched on a bit in your presentation, and ageism and the role that that's playing here, and then maybe Mary could come in on the animal agency issue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think they're really important questions, and although there is, you know, considerable provision for or a considerably powerful narrative about involving older people in decision making, ensuring that older people's aspirations and wishes are attended to, the whole idea about supported decision making for people who perhaps don't have decision making capacity around, you know, for example, a care and support choice. The reality is that older people can get very caught up in the mechanics of care arrangements in a social care system that's frankly very fragmented, a care landscape that's very fragmented, under huge pressure, and often not easily responsive to individual need. And so, as I was alluding to, for example, if people go into hospital and then perhaps are discharged into a care home for assessment, they can sort of get caught up in the sort of mechanics of that. I think if they've got families, sometimes families can take priority in terms of decision making. So I think again, there are fantastic and excellent examples where, people persist in ensuring that people are supported to make shared decisions. But there are other examples where, frankly, people are moved with expediency because it sort of meets needs, and people are deemed to be no longer able to cope, and that's the only option. A care home is the only option, particularly if they start needing care, for example, at night. So there is a long way to go. And I think, picking up on the idea of, things like design and what we would want for the future of care homes. And, I think there's an absence of innovation in social care because it is in quite a parlous state. And it's something that I think we really need to try to promote in terms of, innovating to actually more readily reflect the needs and aspirations of older people. And ageism, I think, underpins an awful lot of this. I've seen only a couple of days ago a public response, a response to the recent announcement by Boris Johnson about the sort of future funding of social care. And the response from this organisation was, we mustn't forget that it's not just old people who pay for care, everyone does. And we don't want people to think this is a marginal issue just relating to older people. So sort of the implication was that sort of older people were a marginal issue. So I do think ageism plays a considerable part. And fundamentally, I think socially we worry a lot about aging. We worry a lot in a society that sort of worships at the altar of autonomy and independence, and that whole narrative about independence. We worry a lot about the idea of losing our memory, or being unable to walk, or becoming disembodied in some way. And so it's a conversation that I think people find quite difficult to have. And I think that sort of underpins kind of ageism, and leave aside, sort of policies and practices that unfortunately are detrimental to the well-being of older people. So there's a lot to do. And, some people could arguably say, you're worrying about pets. What about just thinking about the rights of older people? It's a big question. Sorry, I've gone on a bit. Sorry.
No, it's great, Mo. It is a really big set of questions. So Mary, the agency of animals, and there's a bit in the chat about therapy animals as well. And I wonder if you've got some thoughts on that.
From Liz, yeah. I mean, Katrina, the agency of animals, I think, is so interesting here, and it's hard enough, I think, to assess almost their physical needs. And there's so much debate about even what a good diet is, quite apart from anything else, and I do wonder how that, I was thinking about, say, if a dog's fed raw or whatever, how could you ever accommodate that in a care home? And I assume there's all kinds of issues about, how the diet of older people as well. So when it comes on to assessing their agency, I think that becomes so much harder to do. And then I think we're also thrown back on what are the alternatives. So it's probably not an ideal environment for most animals. But then if the alternatives are being passed around, or maybe going to a home where the people who volunteer to take on the animal aren't really prepared for that animal, that begs really big questions as well. And yeah, the ways in which animals show resistance. And I was thinking when you were saying about that chicken project at Nottingham that showed how much agency chickens had even in really confined situations to resist. All kinds of animal agency, I suppose, needs to be better addressed. So I think those are really interesting questions, and I'm really looking forward to your project, I should say. And Liz, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. We deliberately didn't talk about it here, and I think it is outside the confines of our project to think about animals coming in. But again, I do Yeah, I wonder sometimes how much animals really like being therapy animals or pet animals or whatever. And another, I suppose, interesting move beyond that is to think about robotic animals, and there's big literature emerging on that now as well. So I think, yeah, I think they're great questions. I think they're probably a little bit outside this remit, but you know, maybe they raise fewer issues for animals that do seem to show that they like those activities and benefit from them, than keeping an animal with an older person. And then for some of these older people who are separated from their animals, it might be really good to have therapy animals come in, or see. One of the legal cases we talk about in the project was one where an older person was separated from her animal. And one of the things that her carer said in evidence to the court, where it was an application to remove a deputy who wasn't really protecting her interests, including contact with the animals, was, well, she really lights up when she sees an animal. And I think that can really happen in care homes. So again, there's that potential tension, I think. But certainly therapy animals might pose fewer issues than animals actually being in care homes. But yeah. Good question.
Great. So Vanessa Ashlow, you have your hand up. Can you ask your question, please?
Hello, yes, thank you very much for a really interesting set of presentations. I just wanted to pick up on something that struck me during Michael's presentation, interview data from the care home manager, where she suggested that one of the concerns of having pets in the care home setting was the possibility that the pets might escape. And something that struck me there was to do with my own experiences of family members in care homes, and having that very same reasoning presented as a rationale as to why care home residents, human care home residents, can't access outside spaces and need to be kept inside, and security measures, door locks and all that sort of thing. And it made me start thinking about whether this focus on what animals' needs might be in the care home setting might help to reinvigorate or refocus attention on some of the human care home needs, which might actually currently be overlooked, and the degrees to which those things might actually overlap with each other. For example, exercise to green space, exercise access to green space, and even this idea of overstimulation and the obligation to socialise with unfamiliar people. So a lot of the things that we've brought up with regards to concerns about animals in care home settings, perhaps the care home setting needs to be reviewed more widely in terms of the implications of these challenges for residents who are human and non-human.
There was a really interesting example in one of the care homes where they'd actually used talking about the animals' needs as a sort of tool for discussing end-of-life care options. They were sort of talking about what's the cat going to need as she gets older, what would be important to the cat, and they used that as a way of introducing conversations about sort of, you know, making advanced care directives and so on. So that was quite an interesting example of where they'd done exactly that. But yeah, I think, I mean, actually sort of possibly coming back to some of the earlier conversations around sort of ageism. I think there is an extent to which a lot of this kind of perhaps this very risk-averse discussion also relates to a lot of issues that aren't about animals as well. So there's quite a lot of data about, for example, care homes are being very cautious about people going out in the garden of the care home without someone with them. So yes, I think there are elements there where actually these issues do interrelate in terms of probably how much recognition is of agency is given to both the animal and the person. I think there is a lot of links and overlap there.
I think it's a really interesting point when somebody was talking about volunteers potentially coming in to look after the animals in a care home. I was thinking that there's probably a number of people who would feel more comfortable, sadly, coming into a care home to look after the animals there than to come in to volunteer to be a companion and visitor to some of the residents. So I think you're absolutely right, Vanessa, that the talking about the animals and their needs might be a really interesting way of opening things up. We've had quite a lively conversation going on in the chat between some of our vet participants. I don't want to put people on the spot, but Carl and Carrie in particular, maybe others. I wonder if either of you or both of you would like to maybe summarize what you think are some of the kind of key takeaway issues from a vet point of view.
Can you hear me all right? 'Cause sometimes my microphone's funny on Zoom.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not a vet, but I work in the vet school, but I do a lot of companion animal welfare and animal behaviour teaching and research, and also practical experience. I think my primary concern is that a lot of dogs and cats would struggle living in a care home. So actually there is a really valid point, which I love, that came out of this research, which, as an advocate for human animal interactions and people having pets, and everyone has a right to have a pet, I was so glad it actually came out that people were saying that actually it's often the decision's been made, it's not the right place for the animal. But we do need to provide owners and care homes with tools which are probably already available. So Belinda has posted some tools and things in the chat about ways that they can assess whether the animal is suitable, and ways that the environment can be assessed for whether it's suitable for the animal as well. So this is beyond just who's going to walk the dog, feed the dog type thing, or who's legally going to take responsibility for the animal. So I think there's some stuff that can be done there, and I don't know what the capacity is of this. This is so hard, like with my research as well. Where do you cross the line between we are researchers doing a research project and we're trying to make practical recommendations, but do we have all the time to develop this? And actually, are there already brilliant resources by Dogs Trust, by PDSA, by Cinnamon Trust, and who's going to coordinate and take responsibility for a toolkit that these care homes can actually easily access and find and use? Anyway, that's my primary thoughts, I think, at this moment.
And thank you, Carrie. I think that's actually a brilliant introduction into our next talk. I'll just pause for a moment before introducing Alexandra, just to see if there's any final remark or comment that anybody's been kind of desperate to make before we move on. I think a lot has been said, and of course we're recording this, which means we're recording all of the chat as well. And Mary and Michael and Mo will be able to go over that more thoroughly in their own time and respond to many of the comments that have been made there. So Alexandra, can we come to you to hear your thoughts on developing a code of practice to help older people stay with their pets? I think I've said before, you're from the Pet Industry Federation. We're really pleased you were able to join us today and give us your perspective. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Fiona. And thank you, Mari, for inviting me. I will just share my screen because I have got a couple of slides. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to take up too much, but right, I hope everyone can see that. So yes, it's been really interesting actually finding out about the work that obviously Mari and the team have done at Liverpool and Lincoln and the Dunhill funded research. And we've kind of been doing this sort of this task force work. We started a bit more recently on it, but I think there is definitely a lot of overlap and there is definitely a lot of collaborative work that we might be able to do to hopefully take some of the research and the recommendations forward. And so I think this kind of engagement and opportunities to talk about what we're doing is really, really important. And so thank you ever so much for inviting me. So yeah, I'm actually from the Pet Industry Federation. We're actually a trade association for pet businesses. So we have about 2,000 members that cover a range of sectors such as pet groomers, kennels and catteries, retailers, manufacturers, the whole gamut really. We sit on the steering group of an organisation called the Canine and Feline Sector Group, and that is a coalition really of organisations, welfare groups, enforcement bodies, industry and veterinary groups that reports to the Animal Health and Welfare Board for England, and that in turn reports to DEFRA, and that focuses on dog and cat issues. And it's under the auspices of that group that we are working, that this task force working group really has been put together. So I'll move on to the first slide actually, because that explains it a little bit more. So as I said, it's the Pets and the Elderly Task Force is a group overseen by the Canine and Feline Sector Group. It consists of welfare charities and industry. That's sort of us drawn from the Canine and Feline Sector Group. And we're also bringing in housing associations and private care home groups as well, because one of the things that we're very aware of is that we're coming at it very much from the pet and the animal welfare side of things, and to make our group work, we've got to obviously sort of bring in some of the human health side of things as well, and that's probably something we are a little bit lacking on at the moment, but we're still quite early on in our work. Ultimately, we are hoping to develop some sort of code of practice, a set of guidelines which can be used in a practical way by various care home settings to facilitate access to pets for elderly residents. So whether those are their own pets or whether it's just enabling or breaking down some of the barriers to make care homes feel a bit more confident about having access to pets, we're trying to sort of create some guidelines that will make that a little bit easier. So the task force was established just under a year ago. We actually, the Pet Industry Federation, ran a webinar, and we invited lots of the great and the good and from the welfare and groups, and I think there are a number of people actually who are on this call this afternoon who were part of that really fantastic webinar that we ran, and it really got people quite excited about it. And I think we realized that we wanted to do something a lot more tangible with it. There's no point just having a webinar and we all said, wasn't that lovely, and off we went. We actually wanted to do something that was going to create something much more long-term and really lead to something very tangible and beneficial. So quite soon after that, we put together the first meeting, which was held in December last year. So as I said briefly earlier, the objectives of the group is to really create some sort of guidance document which will be rubber stamped or endorsed by the canine and feline sector group. One of the other things that we really want to try and do is to get CQC endorsement as well, the Care Quality Commission. Obviously, care homes have enough regulation and loopholes and red tape that they have to, and bureaucracy that they have to go through. We don't want to actually add to that, but we ultimately want the guidance document to I suppose make it easier or to kind of break down some of the barriers. It was interesting hearing some of the findings from the research. There really is I think perhaps in some cases a fear or a real lack of knowledge and training about or just assumption that either care homes are just not the right place for pets, and the assumption that they therefore won't have them at all. And I think we want to try and create a document that actually says, no, you can do it, but it has got to be done in a responsible way, which obviously safeguards the animals that are there, as well as is appropriate. And we are very mindful of the fact that not every setting is going to be the correct setting to have pets, and there will be perhaps other alternatives that we could look at to still create some create some of that access between pets and elderly residents. We want to make sure, one of the things that's really important, other than getting that CQC endorsement, is also to get so this was a buy-in from MPs and influential figures. Obviously, the more noise we can make about it, and I think the membership of the group will help us to sort of amplify what the guidance documents will hopefully contain, will help us to reach those sorts of people. And we hope, therefore, to kind of put some of that pressure on. So whether it becomes, I don't think we're necessarily moving for it to kind of form any kind of legislation, but whether it does hopefully gain some traction amongst care home managers and those that sort of operate them, that they will see the benefits of having pets, and that they'll be able to use the guidelines to make that access a lot easier for themselves. So the guidance will cover, it will look at the benefits of pets to people. I think a lot of care homes can be very may not be aware of actually how much benefit pets actually bring to people generally. There's a lot of research that's certainly been undertaken by places like the Society for Companion Animal Studies, where people getting huge amounts of emotional and mental benefits by having access to pets, and that can be passed on. Care homes can benefit from some of that, but they may see the barriers before they see the benefits, and so we want to try and we want the guidance to really spell out what those benefits actually are. We want to look at things like how elderly people can access pets. I said it may be that not every setting is correct, depending on the sort of the needs of the residents. And we want the guidance to cover the sort of the key points, perhaps, of the ways in which providers can facilitate this and make it happen. And it may be that they have to, you know, link up with places like Pets as Therapy and bring those sorts of animals in if it's not the right setting to have either residents' own animals or to even have their own animals on site that kind of belong to the care home. There are probably other routes as well that would be good to highlight in the document. And obviously, it needs to highlight all the considerations that pets and humans need to need to have access to in order to be safe. Obviously, again, depending on the needs of the human of the elderly resident, we need to make sure that you know, if they've got very fragile skin, that they don't have a cat which is suddenly going to go berserk on it, and equally that the pets themselves, that there is a plan for them to make sure that they're safeguarded too. So it really is important that everyone's needs are well catered for in this document. So it's a huge area. The environments at the moment that we're kind of looking at, and we may well narrow some of these down, as if we're quite early on in some of our project work, and we're really just at the moment going through a huge research process to gather all the information that's out there, because there is a lot of it. But at the moment, we think that our project will cover things like sheltered accommodation, private care homes, people at home with carers, so maybe people who are still independently living, but maybe who need that extra bit of support and help in order to be able to keep, to be able to properly care for their pets, and local authority care homes as well. So we're trying to put quite a broad spectrum of establishments into our guidance. So as I said earlier, that there's a large body of work that already exists out there, and this obviously the Dunhill work is another area of research that we really want to tap into. We've actually set up much smaller working groups to focus on different areas that we want the guidance to look at. And those working groups are covering areas such as the research aspects, the benefits of pets, so pulling all of that information together. We've got a group that's looking specifically at the pets and what needs they need to have considered when they're in a care home, and also then the human health considerations. So what factors do we need to bear in mind there as well? So the working groups are actually at the moment, and there are a number of working group members I've noticed on the call this afternoon as well. They've been working really diligently to kind of create their own body of work, really, of research that will help to inform the guidance project as it enters its next steps. So really, just to kind of wrap up, I mean, we'd very much be interested, I think, in kind of continuing our dialogue that we've sort of started with Michael and Mari, to see if we can, I guess I'm never one for trying to sort of reinvent the wheel. I think if some of the research is there, we want to kind of add it into what we're doing, and maybe we, through our task force, can take things a step further. We've still got a long way to go. There's a lot of questions we haven't answered yet. There's a lot of questions that have been raised this afternoon that I've thought we need to make sure we're looking at that and we're considering it, because we're by no means at a stage where we've got some kind of final document. We know that we want it to link into the Animal Welfare Act, and we want it to link into the CQC's pillars that they put out, that they need, that their regulations that care homes need to meet. We want to make sure that it is as easy and as practical as possible for people to implement in those sorts of environments, so that ultimately people can hopefully gain the benefits of pets well into their you know, wherever they are spending their sort of later years in life, really. So I hope that gives a very brief insight into the work that we're doing. I'm happy to take any questions on it, but I think most importantly is we're very keen to keep the dialogue going, as I think we've started doing over the last couple of months. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Alexandra. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in the chat, particular for you making this piece of work as all-encompassing as possible in terms of the range of settings that you're addressing, and that coming through from a number of participants. You can read the chat there.
Yeah.
So unless there's anything pressing there that you want to answer immediately. I think the takeaway from this meeting today, I think, is that there are so many different organisations all encountering the same set of issues in the same space, the move towards clearer guidance, clearer understanding of the issues, a clearer platform for advocacy on this issue from many different parts of the sector is much needed. And I think we hope that this research will play its role, and that your work will play its role in helping to create more of a voice on this issue. So I think it remains to me, we promised we'd finish by 5:02, and we're going to manage that. It remains to me to thank everyone who's presented today, and to thank all of the participants for what I think has been a really engaging and lively session. The research will go on to be published with its recommendations. And I'm sure, Alexandra, there'll be plenty of opportunities for further engagement with your project. Mari, sorry, Alexandra, do come in.
I was just actually reading some of the chat, so just to if people, I've noticed that Carrie's made a note about wanting to join. Yes, I think if people would like to be involved, and it would be fantastic. I mean, I think everyone's got so much to bring to this particular project. I realise I didn't put what I'll do is I'll put my email address on the chat now, so obviously I can engage with relevant people at that point then. So thank you very much.
Yeah. And Mari, I don't know if you've got any final concluding remarks before we close.
I think all I can really say is just thanks so much to everyone. I think I haven't had the chance to read everything in the chat, but just what I've picked up looks, really insightful. And as Fiona says, there's lots of publications that we're in the process of working on. Really happy to carry on these kinds of dialogues. And Alexandra, thank you so much for coming and telling us about your work, because I think that's really important. It's come up in a lot of the interviews we've done as well about how crucial it is. And I'm just so struck also listening to it. I mean, it's really interesting that what you're being pushed to do, and we talked about the challenges of containing work, and you're being pushed to broaden your work. And I think this is such an interesting topic for just thinking through a range of issues. And I suppose the final thing I'd just say is I'm really struck by listening to this, though, the absence of the state. There's so much about charities, the Pet Federation, and charities giving their time to that kind of task force. I know it's under the aegis of DEFRA as well, but there is an absence of the state and that state responsibility, I think, for all of these issues, which is quite interesting, perhaps. But yeah, we're just really grateful to everyone who's taken their time, and thank you for such constructive input. And I know there are things we haven't really addressed properly. So we can definitely follow on with those. And thanks for sharing, Fiona. And then, finally, and most importantly, thank you so much to Dunhill Trust for funding the project, and also for being the people I've dealt with there have been so incredibly supportive, and especially as Michael said, through the pandemic, and when we've had to change some of our original plans, we've had to get new ethics approval. So everyone there has been really supportive. So thank you very much.
Great. So thanks, Mari, thanks, Michael and Mo and Alexandra for your contributions. Thanks to everybody who signed up and joined the session today. And thanks to Michael and Alan, who facilitated behind the scenes very effectively and without being seen at all. So goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.